my name is Ruhi Sophia Matzkin-Rubenstein. My title is Rabbi. I'm the Rabbi of Temple Beth Israel in South Eugene. And I've been the rabbi here since the summer of 2015. The job is what brought me to Eugene, Oregon, prior to my first in-person interview for the job in December of 2014. Remember when we were doing in-person interviews? Prior to that, I'd never been to the state of Oregon, let alone Eugene. I grew up in upstate New York in a small city called Saratoga Springs, north of Albany, the capital, and about a 4-hour drive north of New York City. And so primarily grew up there, went to college on the East Coast, went to rabbinical school on the East Coast, and did all of my rabbinical training on the East Coast, and with 2 years in Jerusalem. My mother's family is from the West Coast. She grew up in Los Angeles. So I did grow up visiting California, but like I said, had never been to Oregon. A rabbinic job search is very much like an academic job search though. So there's only a few positions open a year and people are applying all over the country. And so Eugene was not even on my list, to be honest, when I was applying. My husband had one more year of rabbinical school that he had to complete. So I was sure that I needed to stay on the East Coast. I did not want to be long distance from him for a year. But many mentors and friends kept saying, you should apply for that job in Eugene, Oregon. And you know, even just for practice at the job application process, you should apply for that job. And so for practice, I did, and I kept at each level of the interview saying to my husband, we might have to take this possibility more seriously than we thought. And I just kind of by stages fell in love with this community.
What has your experience been in a Jewish community here in Eugene, Oregon?
There are many things I love about Eugene and about the Jewish community particularly. You know, my husband and I were living in Manhattan when I was applying for jobs, and we were just so thrilled. We were living in Manhattan and like trying to can all of our own tomato sauce from like, we'd order tens and scores of pounds of tomatoes from our CSA share north of the city and try to do all our canning in a New York City kitchen. And we just like loved the idea of going to a place with like a bike culture and a food culture and a hiking culture and an outdoor culture. And have continued to love that as we have lived here and raised children here. It is definitely challenging to be in a place where Jews are such a small minority, and Jews who are affiliated, who identify as Jews and choose to be in Jewish community, seek Jewish community, are an even smaller minority. I had never been in a place before where there was just so little awareness of Jewish community, and where what I would call secular Christian hegemony is so strong. Meaning, you know, so many people in Eugene, the majority of people in Eugene don't necessarily identify as Christian, but their default nothing that they are is very unconsciously informed by Christianity and a sort of bafflement about any cultural practice that isn't Christianity. So that's how it could wind up being, you know, so very controversial when we were advocating for the 4J school holiday policy to change. And we could have people saying the kinds of things they said, which, you know, which I heard, which were like, well, it's not our fault that winter break happens to be over Christmas. And sort of that unconsciousness around like, no, it's not your fault, but there is this history that, you know, we live in a majority Christian culture, which informs everything. And especially for people who don't actively identify as Christian, there is this unawareness of the ways that makes life difficult or marginalizing for people who do actively identify as something other than Christian. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, well, I'm Jewish, and I grew up
Okay.
in Brooklyn, which was a largely Jewish community, and where we all knew each other. I spent Christmas with my neighbors, and they came over for Passover, and so we shared holidays and we understood them very well. My most shocking thing was when a parent-teacher conference was scheduled for Yom Kippur at the village school, and I was like, what? Like, how are you not aware of this one holiday where no one's allowed to, like, no one's supposed to go beyond walking or leave their house, or I mean, this is the most holy day of the year, and we don't even know about this one. um, and some of the responses I've gotten from people over time, they have no idea about most of the holidays, even the ones that I've always thought, oh, everybody knows about Passover, everybody knows Rosh Hashanah, everybody knows even Hanukkah, but no, I mean, never mind all the other ones.
Right. And it really is unawareness, right? There's
Yeah.
no malice. There's no malice, just utter bafflement.
Mhm.
And I think it's particularly difficult. It's particularly difficult to explain Jewish commitment because people tend to classify Judaism as a religion, and people think of religion as creedal. So that means, people assume that, oh, so what is it that Jews believe or, don't believe? And that's a really difficult question to answer because Judaism is a cultural identification, it's an ethnic identification. And we have at Temple Beth Israel, probably at least a third of our community is actively atheist. And so to try to explain what people best understand as a religious commitment, but that is not about a deep creedal belief necessarily, can be very confounding. Like a lot can get lost in translation. Or people assume that, well, their Jewish friend has never talked about like believing something particularly religiously. So why would this one holiday be so important to them? Not sure, but there is one more thing I could say about sort of the joyful challenge of rabbiing in Eugene,
Mhm.
which is, I think a certain sort of intense individualism is to some extent pandemic across the entirety of the United States. But I think it is more extreme on the West Coast and in Oregon, and I encounter it transcending politics, right? I encounter it on the right and on the left and in the center in Eugene, a certain sense of like a basic human right is to do what I want and not have to do what I don't want and not have anybody tell me what I should or should not be doing. And I think that is pretty contrary to what I understand Judaism to be and what I am trying to bring. So it feels very countercultural frequently to be pushing Jewish community, pushing a sense of communal obligation, suggesting a sense of communal obligation to people, which can be tiring and feels very important. Feels very important to be offering an alternative, a cultural alternative to this individualism.
Right. So that is an interesting piece too, because we've been discussing civic engagement especially in the last year. And how have you seen Eugene in terms of civic engagement and any changes in the last year, especially since the administration has been changing, Black Lives Matter, the pandemic and things like, and the political kind of shiftings that have been happening in the last year in particular?
What I have observed in my time here is that especially the previous administration was really motivating for a lot of people. A lot of people who are generally pretty comfortable in the status quo, including people in my own community, were made uncomfortable by the previous administration. And so we're actively civically engaged. And, you know, one of the things I'm very curious about is, will that civic engagement last? I also think there's been amazing civic engagement in Eugene around the pandemic and around Black Lives Matter. Black Unity has done incredible mutual aid work, mostly under the radar and without much, if any, acknowledgement in the press. There's been a lot of mutual aid. There's been a lot of organizing outside of government structures to help people. And ideally, I think that organizing happens along with organizing within government to help people. One thing that worries me is this last administration, and to some extent, you know, to a great extent, even before that, for years, there has been an undermining of the government's role and participation in upholding civic good for all citizens. So citizens are increasingly kind of disillusioned with the idea that government could do anything productive to help people. And I'm concerned about that. I think mutual aid is important. I think charitable giving is important, and the ways we organize in religious communities are important. But, you know, the pandemic shows us there's only so much that small scale organizing can do. And we should not give up on the idea of good government, even as we acknowledge the ways that we have always fallen short of realizing the vision of good government.
Looking at the anti-Semitism of this country in the last year, what do you think about that?
Anti-Semitism, like most forms of oppression, doesn't belong to any one political side.
Right.
And, you know, people on the left, Jews on the left love claiming that the right is anti-Semitic. Jews on the right love claiming that the left is anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is sort of an unconsciously conditioned prejudice, like most other prejudices, and people on the right have it, people on the left are conditioned to it. It's not that easy to shake a trope that has been in constant formation for 2,000 years. That said, I do think the more violent forms, the more violent manifestations of anti-Semitism in terms of the actual killing of Jews in this country have largely come from the right. In the past year in Lane County, our community has been fairly fortunate. There hasn't been any particular flare that I am aware of. Obviously, we know that in the last 5 years or so, as other white nationalist, nativist sentiments are on the rise, anti-Semitism has risen as part of that. White supremacist and white national groups do not consider Jews, you know, even what other people would consider to be white Jews, do not consider us to be white. And frankly, I don't want to be part of their whiteness either. But I don't really know where to go with this.
Right.
I think it has been a scary time to be Jewish. I think Jews are more frightened in the last year. I remember being very frightened between the election and January 20th. I remember thinking there's all of this trope about the election being stolen by a nefarious power. And the anti-Semitic trope is always about Jewish global power seeking to undermine government. It only would take one person who's really believed that and really angry in Lane County to come and do harm to our institution. I'm very relieved that that hasn't happened. I'm also aware that it could happen at any moment. I have also, in these past years really wanted to make a commitment to not acting based out of fear. I think it's very easy when we're afraid to turn insular and to turn just to thinking about how we can protect our institution against external threat. So for me, it has been very important that, that we think about these issues holistically, that anti-Semitism is on the rise, all these other forms of violence and bigotry, and that it is our duty in this moment to be as open an institution as we can be and be in as many coalitions with other marginalized groups as we can be.
What do you do? I mean, you yourself and the congregation as a whole do to make sure that your voices are heard in the community to help move this civic discourse forward?
Well, our community, the Temple Beth Israel community, has several different activist committees. There is a group that focuses on sort of general social action, social justice organizing. They did a big get out the vote push back in August through November, and then again, long distance for Georgia through January. They've done a lot of coalition work and creating events with environmental groups in town. There's also a committee, our sanctuary committee is dedicated specifically to issues of immigration rights and immigration justice. And about a year ago, our synagogue board responded to a call by some national Jewish leaders of color to address the racism within the Jewish community and white centering within the Jewish community. And that call is called the Not Free to Desist call. It's based on a quote from Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, and the early level of Jewish oral tradition that says, it's not yours to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from doing your role in it. And so we now have a Not Free to Desist task force that has been working very slowly to sort of do the work carefully and make sure that the Jews of color in our own community are engaged in appropriate ways that they would like to be, and are beginning to offer suggestions around programming and educational content that we should be doing both internally in the synagogue and in the wider community. I think it's important, I've spoken about the community a few times. So I am the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel. I'm not the rabbi of the Jewish community of Eugene. There are other synagogues in Eugene. And there is an organized civic Jewish community through the Jewish Federation of Lane County, whose purview it is to be sort of the public non-religious face of Jews. And they run a Jewish Community Relations Council, which I sit on as one of many people on that council. And I think the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation is also very intent on building coalitions and putting out statements when necessary. And then I personally write a monthly op-ed in the Register Guard, which is not something I sought. I was recruited by the Register Guard to do that. More often than not, I find it very stressful to find something relevant to say. But I think we engage in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that other religious communities need to be more active? Do you think that, I do see other religions being active in our community, we have a very civically minded Reverend Bryant has been involved with the homeless community for many, many years. And his congregation has kind of taken his call to action very seriously. I think, you know, I guess I'm going to ask you, Ansaki, because I grew up here. This is I've never lived more than 30 miles away from here. How is Eugene different in that kind of civic, involvement? Is Eugene different?
The civic involvement by religious institutions?
Yeah.
I haven't noticed Eugene to be particularly different in terms of civic involvement by its religious institutions from other places I've lived. Look, I think it's a complicated thing because our country is hypothetically founded on separation of church and state. And yet a certain vision of Christianity has such a dominant influence on what the country's mainstream normative values are, or at least a narrative of what our normative values are. It's so dominant that in fact it has even co-opted the word Jewish. When people talk about Judeo-Christian values, they're not talking about Judaism. So to say, do I think religious groups should be more or should be less politically active is a very charged question and kind of difficult, almost impossible for me to answer, right? I could say very honestly and hypocritically and inappropriately, so, to be clear, tongue in cheek, like, yeah, I think the groups that agree with me should be more politically active. But in seriousness, I think religion is political in that it speaks to us about how we organize community, how we organize body politic, and what our priorities should be when confronted with the challenges of living in community with other people. And I think that, I will say, I think that religious institutions that take that understanding of religion into the public life beyond their sanctuary are enacting their faith and enacting their values. And some institutions have very different, some religions have very different some religious institutions have very different faith and values and priorities than the ones, that I understand Judaism to demand of me. And so saying that they should be taking their faith into the streets means I'm going to be butting against them when I'm taking my faith into the streets. But I do think that's a healthy political discourse when we're talking about what are our values and how are we working to meet them. And I think the first step is always to be looking at what we could be doing better and leading from that.
Right.
Not from this is somebody else's problem or some other institution that has more resources, they should be doing more.
Yeah, it's the not in our backyard. We need to be looking at our own backyard and what we could be doing better. Always.
I have one quick question. It's not a quick question at all, but how do you think that Jewish knowings or whatever, or the understanding of the Jewish culture and they can be heard in the Eugene community? How do we educate more about the Jewish community in Eugene?
I think there are good efforts underway already. And I'm pleased that, in the last 2 years, for example, the school board has been receptive to reimagining its religious holiday policy. I think there's a challenge in this moment that I am noticing where, because so many Jews, especially in Eugene, are white,
Mhm.
there is often a forgetting or confusion about the place of white Jews in a multicultural discourse. And one of the ways that anti-Semitism classically functions is to cast Jews as all powerful and therefore invulnerable, and therefore not a suitable ally for groups fighting for liberation. And I think the Jewish community locally is working really hard to show up as an ally. Always could be working harder, and will continue to work hard. But the extent to which other marginalized groups also understand that is very helpful.
It doesn't seem like the curriculum in the 4J school actually is addressing like just learn about all the different religions, learn about a lot of different cultures so that the kids start to learn that there's more than one way to cook a pot.
Yeah.
So I've thought about that quite a bit.
There
So,
is a movement to move cultural anthropology classes into the elementary and high school, because we don't actually get those until we get to college. And I know that was a big thing for me when I took a cultural anthropology class, to kind of see the whole world instead of our own little corner of it. And really, I think it was a turning point in my life. I really think it connected me to something that I hadn't connected to before. And I'd be willing to fight for that, because I think it's important. It's something that we are very much lacking in our curriculum at the early ages.
But I also think there is an inherent value to showing up in uncomfortable spaces.
Mhm.
Whenever I speak to a community group, and I've spoken to Rotary Club and Kiwanis Club and different classes at the university and different churches, I always invite people to come to synagogue. Just come see what we do, demystify it. And I think it comes back to that individualistic culture that we have, which is not only about like, why would I do something I don't want to do, but also like, why would anybody else want me in their space? So I'm really interested in showing up in spaces that feel uncomfortable to me and inviting people into spaces that feel uncomfortable to them. And if the synagogue is one such space, like all the more so, people are invited to come. Well, nowadays, give us a call first and make sure there's capacity. We're being very COVID careful and very low capacity.
do you have any last words or thoughts that you'd like to share at this moment?
Sure. There's a couple of specific Jewish values that I am finding very grounding as I navigate our current moment. One is the idea of teshuvah, which often is translated as repentance in English, but it is more than repentance, because repentance is often conceived of as a very personal process between oneself and God. Teshuvah is repentance in action. So it is the process by which a person or a community acknowledges when they have done wrong, confesses it, sets an intention to do better, does whatever they can to right the wrong, to fix it, to make restitution if they've wronged another person or another community, and then continues holding themselves accountable to transformation. And And we talk about this, Jews talk about this notion a lot around our high holidays in the fall, but it is a value all the time. And I, in this moment of communal reckoning around Black Lives Matter, around moving out of this pandemic, find it to be a very powerful notion because it is predicated on an understanding of human nature that says people are not inherently evil. Neither are we inherently good. We're full of moral possibility. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to cause harm. And we have the capacity to do better. So in a political and civic context that is so rife with refusal to apologize or acknowledge wrongdoing often, and a sort of cancel culture when people do acknowledge wrongdoing, or when wrongdoing is found, of just like, get rid of this person, get rid of this institution, they are unredeemable. I find the implication of human redeemability inherent in the notion of teshuvah really powerful and necessary. So I've been teaching a lot from that place and grounding myself a lot. And the second one that I want to mention is the idea of machloket, which is a phrase that comes a lot in our oral tradition and means debate, disagreement, which is a Jewish value. In our Jewish oral tradition, the majority opinions and the opinions that win the arguments about Jewish law are preserved in the text as alongside the losing opinions. And generally, the losing opinions are acknowledged to be based in valid reasoning, even if the law goes even when the law goes in a different direction. And there's a very famous quote describing the disagreements between the ancient house of Hillel and the ancient house of Shammai that said, a voice descended from heaven saying, Ilu ve'ilu divrei Elohim chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. Even though Jewish law is going to follow one opinion, don't think it is because the other side is unequivocally wrong. And I think we are really missing that understanding in our public discourse as well. And as someone who has, thought of myself as very politically progressive and somewhat radical, as I mean, maybe it's just getting a little older, but also I think in response to this political discourse, I'm noticing that it feels increasingly radical to take a stand against moral binaries, against the idea that one position is completely good and right and one position is completely bad and wrong, which isn't to say, like, I'm against white supremacy. I want to be fighting white supremacy. But when it comes to people talking about the difficult on the ground issues of how do we solve a problem like homelessness in Eugene? How do we solve problems of creating religiously pluralistic communities? I am more and more aware that there are a lot of really decent, well-meaning people with a lot of really different ideas based on their own life experiences, and that, people with whom I disagree are not bad and wrong.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you so much.